She carried a scar on her face that everyone used to push her away, but an Apache warrior looked at her as if that wound was beautiful and saw in it the soul he had waited his whole life to love. The sun rose slowly over Jacusol, a dust devil mesa, painting the adobe houses spread out like open wounds in the New Mexico desert in gold. It was 1847, and the small town was thick with tension. Not just because of the heat, which promised to be cruel that June day, but because of the fear that hung in the air like invisible barbed wire. Clara Mendoza folded the blue fabric between her calloused fingers and sighed. The needle slid through the cloth with the precision of someone who had learned that life depended on perfect stitches. Every movement was calculated, silent. She had become a shadow, and shadows make no sound. Outside her small home, the voices of the townswomen echoed as always. They talked about their children, their husbands, the lack of rain. Clara knew every tone, every laugh. She knew exactly when they stopped talking to whisper, and she knew those whispers always had the same target. "That cursed girl," muttered Mrs. Esperanza Sanchez, the richest merchant's wife in town. "I still believe she caused that fire. It's not natural for an entire family to die like that, and only she survive." Clara closed her eyes. The needle trembled between her fingers. "My mother always said too much beauty attracts the devil," another voice added. Maybe it was a punishment. The fabric fell to the floor. Clara instinctively touched the left side of her face, where the wrinkled, reddish skin stretched from her temple to her chin. The scar seemed to pulse like a fresh wound whenever she heard those words. 5 years. 5 years since the night her life turned to ashes. She remembered everything. The smell of smoke that woke her, her mother's screams, her father's desperation trying to save them, and the man she saw fleeing the house with a gallon of kerosene in his hands. The same man who now commanded the town council. The same man everyone respected, but who would believe her? The cursed girl of Dust Devil Mesa. Clara picked up the fabric and went back to work. That was how she survived. Sewing in silence, accepting scraps, pretending the words didn't cut deep. Before the fire, she had been the most courted girl in town. Hair black as night, brown eyes that shone like honey in the sun, a smile that made boys forget their own names. Now, at 22, she was invisible. Worse than invisible, she was an uncomfortable reminder that beauty could disappear in one night. Her door opened slowly. Clara looked up and saw little Maiji Maria Rodriguez, Mrs. Rosa Rodriguez's daughter, peeking in with curiosity. "What do you want, sweetie?" Clara asked, forcing a smile. The 7-year-old girl ran in and clung to Clara's skirts. "My mom tore my dress," the child whispered. "Can you fix it?" Clara caressed the little girl's hair. Children were the only ones who still saw her as a person. They didn't understand scars or curses. They only saw someone who fixed their toys and gave them hidden sweets. "Of course I can," Clara replied, taking the torn dress. "But you can't stay long. Your mum doesn't like you coming here." Maria nodded, serious as an adult. "She says you're dangerous, but I think you're just sad." The child's words pierced Clara's chest like a blade. Sad. Yes, she was sad, but she was also much more than that. She was swallowed rage, chewed up hurt, dreams buried alive. "There you go," Clara said, returning the mended dress in a few minutes. "Now run along before your mom notices you've left." Maria kissed Clara's scarred face without hesitation and ran outside. Clara stood at the door, watching the girl disappear among the houses. The sun was already high, and the heat was beginning to intensify. But it wasn't the heat that bothered her. It was the strange silence that had settled over the town. Then she heard it. Male voices, tense and worried, hurried footsteps, the sound of horses. Clara hid behind the door and peeked out. A group of men gathered in the town square, led by Sheriff Carlos Carl Herrera, the same man she had seen fleeing her house that terrible night. He gesticulated nervously as he spoke to the others. "The situation is critical," he said, his voice laden with false authority. 2 months without rain. The wells are drying up. If we don't find a solution, we'll have to abandon Dust Devil Mesa." "And what do you suggest?" another man asked. Sheriff Herrera looked towards the mountains to the north, where he knew the Apache lived. "We have to negotiate with the savages." He spat the words as if they were poison. "They control access to the Bolost River. It's our only water source now." A murmur of discontent spread through the group. Clara knew the men of the town feared the Apache, even though they had never been attacked by them. It was fear of the unknown, of the different. Fear fueled by exaggerated stories and prejudice. "Are you sure they'll agree to negotiate?" another man asked. "They need supplies that only we can provide," Sheriff Herrera replied. "We'll make an offer, but keep your weapons ready. I don't trust them." Clara felt something tighten in her stomach. She knew that look from Sheriff Herrera. It was the same look he had when he planned his schemes, the same look as the night he killed her parents. For the rest of the morning, the town buzzed with preparations. Men cleaned their weapons, women hid their children, and everyone whispered about the savages who would come to negotiate. Clara continued sewing, but her ears were attentive to every word. When the church bell rang at noon, announcing the visitor's arrival, she put her work aside and went to the window. 3 riders approached along the dirt road that led to the mountains. Even from a distance, Clara could see they were Apache. They rode with a natural elegance, as if they were part of the horses themselves. They wore leather and cloth clothing, with adornments that shimmered in the sun. What caught her attention most was the man leading the way. Tall, broad-shouldered, with black hair pulled back and skin tanned by the desert sun. He moved with a silent authority, like someone accustomed to leading. But there was something in his posture that Clara immediately recognized. Pain. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. It was in the way he held his shoulders rigid, in the way his eyes scanned the horizon without ever truly focusing on anything. Clara knew that pain. It was the pain of someone who had lost everything. The 3 Apaches stopped in the center of the town. Sheriff Herrera and his men approached, tense as taut ropes. Clara slowly left her house, mingling with the other people gathering to observe. "I am Sheriff Carlos Herrera, leader of this community," he said with ill-concealed arrogance. "Have you come to negotiate?" The Apache leading the group dismounted with a fluid movement. He was younger than Clara had thought, perhaps a few years older than her. His eyes were dark as night and held a sharp intelligence that sent a shiver down her spine. "I am Nantan," he said in a deep, controlled voice. "I've come to speak about the water." Sheriff Herrera nodded, but Clara noticed how his hand instinctively moved to the weapon at his hip. "The Lost River has always been the territory of my ancestors," Nantan continued. "But we understand that everyone needs water to survive. We are willing to share, if you are willing to respect our terms." "What terms?" Sheriff Herrera asked suspiciously. "No hunting on our sacred lands, no cutting trees along the riverbanks, and respect for our ancestors buried there." Clara watched Sheriff Herrera's expression harden. She knew he was calculating, looking for ways to circumvent those terms. That was how he always did it. He would agree, but already planned to cheat. "We'll discuss this," Sheriff Herrera finally said. "But first, do you need water and food for your journey back?" Nantan hesitated for a moment, and Clara saw something in his eyes that moved her. Weariness, the weariness of someone who carried too many responsibilities on his shoulders. "We appreciate it," he replied. It was then that it happened. As the men moved away for negotiations, the townswomen began to approach to observe the Apache closely. Clara was among them, trying to remain invisible as always, when Mrs. Esperanza Sanchez began to speak. "Look at them," she said, with ill-concealed disdain. "Dirty savages. I bet they don't even know what a bath is." Other women laughed. Clara felt her face burn with vicarious shame. "At least they look like real men," commented Mrs. Isabel Gomez, looking maliciously at Clara. "Not like some here that even a wild animal wouldn't want." The laughter grew louder. Clara lowered her head, feeling the familiar weight of humiliation descend upon her shoulders like a heavy cloak. It was then that Nantan turned. His eyes met hers for an instant that seemed to last an eternity. Clara saw surprise in that look, not surprise at the scar, surprise at something else, as if he were seeing something no one else saw. Then, to everyone's astonishment, Nantan walked to where wildflowers grew by the roadside. He picked a small bouquet with careful gestures and walked directly towards Clara. The silence that fell over the town was complete. Not even the wind dared to blow. Nantan stopped before Clara and held out the flowers. Their eyes met again, and this time she didn't look away. There was something in those dark eyes that made her feel seen, truly seen. "For you," he said, his voice low and gentle. Clara looked at the flowers, then at him, then at the scandalized faces of the women around. Her hands trembled as she reached for the bouquet. "Thank you," she whispered, barely able to speak. Nantan nodded slightly and moved away. But before turning away completely, Clara saw something in his eyes that sent another shiver down her spine. Recognition, as if he too carried scars, only his weren't visible. The moment broke when Mrs. Esperanza Sanchez exploded. "What is this nonsense?" she cried. "A decent woman doesn't accept flowers from a savage. Especially a cursed one like her," Mrs. Isabel Gomez added. "They make a good pair," she spat the words. "Curse with curse." The other women murmured in agreement, but Clara wasn't listening. She was looking at the flowers in her hands, small, delicate, but resilient. Flowers that grew in the desert where nothing should grow. Like her. For the first time in 5 years, Clara raised her head and looked directly at the women who tortured her. "Maybe you're right," she said, in a voice she didn't recognize as her own. "Maybe I do need someone who understands what it's like to be cast out." And with the flowers pressed against her chest, Clara turned her back on the scandalized women and walked home. But this time she wasn't fleeing. She was walking. Outside, negotiations between Sheriff Herrera and Nantan had begun. But Clara knew those flowers had changed something irreversible. And deep in her heart, where she kept her most secret dreams, a small flame began to flicker. The next 3 days changed everything in Dust Devil Mesa. Not because the negotiations with the Apache were particularly complicated. In fact, Nantan had proven to be fairer and more honorable than any man Clara knew. The problem was elsewhere. The problem was that Nantan hadn't stopped looking at her. Clara pressed the dried flowers between the pages of the only Bible that remained from the fire. They had withered, but their sweet scent still permeated the air when she opened the book. It was a constant reminder of that moment when, for the first time in years, someone had seen her as more than a walking scar. Outside, she heard the increasingly agitated voices of the townswomen. The scandal of the flowers had spread like wildfire. Now every move Clara made was observed, commented on, judged. "Yesterday I saw her looking towards the mountains," Mrs. Esperanza Sanchez said, her voice laced with venom. "She's bewitched by that savage." "My daughter said she saw her smiling," Mrs. Isabel Gomez added. "Smiling, as if she didn't know her place." Clara closed her eyes and tried to focus on her sewing, but her hands trembled, not from fear as before. It was something different. It was rage. A soft knock at the door made her look up. Clara hesitated before opening it. Outside, Maria waited with a bundle in her small hands. "My mom sent you to make me a new dress," the girl said, holding out the fabric. "For Sunday's festival." Clara took the fabric, a fine cotton, blue as the sky. It was the kind of order she hadn't received in years. Well-paid work for a special occasion. "Your mom really asked for this?" Clara asked suspiciously. Maria nodded, but Clara noticed the girl wasn't looking her in the eyes. Something felt off, very off. "All right," Clara finally said. "Tell your mum it'll be ready tomorrow." When the girl left, Clara examined the fabric more carefully. It was too beautiful, too expensive. Mrs. Rosa Rodriguez would never spend so much money on a dress for her daughter, especially not by ordering it from Clara, but she needed the work. And maybe, just maybe, it was a sign that things were changing. Clara had just begun to sew when she heard footsteps approaching. She looked out the window and felt her heart quicken. Nantan was walking alone down the dirt road, observing the houses with curiosity. He seemed lost. Without thinking twice, Clara opened the door. "Are you looking for something?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Nantan turned towards the voice, and a subtle smile appeared on his lips when he saw her. "I'm looking for the blacksmith's house," he said. "I need a bridle repaired." Clara pointed to the end of the street. "2 houses past the church, but he's not there now. He went to get iron from the next town over." Nantan nodded and took a few steps closer. Clara noticed he limped slightly on his left leg. "You're hurt," she said without thinking. "Old wound," he replied simply. "From a battle I prefer to forget." There was something in the way he said it that made Clara understand that battle had cost more than a scar on his leg. It had cost him something from his heart. "The flowers are drying nicely," Clara said, changing the subject. "Thank you for them." Nantan studied her for a long moment. Clara braced herself for the familiar embarrassment, for the averted gaze when he noticed the scar up close. But it didn't happen. "You have kind eyes," he said simply. Like someone I knew." Clara felt something tighten in her chest. There was pain in that voice, a pain she recognized. "You lost someone." It wasn't a question. Nantan nodded slowly. "My wife. Consumption 2 winters ago." "I'm sorry." "And you?" he asked. "Did you lose someone in the fire?" Clara swallowed hard. No one asked about the fire. No one wanted to know how she felt about that night. "My parents," she whispered, and myself. I lost who I was before." Nantan took another step, coming so close that Clara could see the golden reflections in his dark eyes. "Perhaps you've just found who you truly are," he said gently. "Sometimes pain shows us our true strength." Before Clara could answer, loud voices approached. It was a group of townswomen, led by Mrs. Esperanza Sanchez. They stopped when they saw Clara and Nantan talking, and the scandal was immediate. "Just look," Mrs. Esperanza Sanchez cried. "The shameless hussy is showing herself off to the savage." "Right in front of her house, brazen," Mrs. Isabel Gomez added. Nantan turned to the women with an icy expression. Clara saw a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Excuse me," he said with sharp courtesy. "I was merely asking for directions." "Directions to what?" Mrs. Esperanza Sanchez asked, defiantly. "To her bed?" The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Clara felt her face burn with humiliation, but this time there was something more. Rage, pure, crystal-clear rage. "You should be ashamed," Clara said, in a voice that surprised even herself. "He's being respectful, more respectful than any man in this town." The women gasped. Clara had never spoken like this. She had never defended herself. "How dare you?" Mrs. Esperanza Sanchez cried. "You're selling yourself to a savage." "And you're speaking like a viper," Clara retorted, feeling courage swell in her chest. "At least he treats me like a person." Nantan looked at Clara with something that could have been admiration, but he said nothing. He simply nodded slightly to her and walked away, moving with dignity as the women spat insults at his back. When he disappeared, Mrs. Esperanza Sanchez turned to Clara with hatred in her eyes. "You'll regret this, you cursed girl. This town has ways of dealing with women who forget their place." And she walked away, dragging the others behind her. Clara stood at the door, trembling, but not from fear, from adrenaline. For the first time in her life she had said what she really thought, and she felt alive. The next 2 days were hell. Stones were thrown at Clara's window during the night. Someone spread horse manure at her front door. The few women who still gave her work cancelled their orders. Clara was being pushed out of town, slowly but inexorably. But it was on the morning of the festival that everything exploded. Clara woke to screams coming from the town square. She dressed quickly and ran to see what was happening. A crowd gathered around Nantan and his two companions. Sheriff Herrera was in the center, gesticulating dramatically. "Thieves!" he shouted. "They stole the supplies we promised in exchange for water access." Clara approached, her heart pounding. Nantan was still as a statue, but she could see the tension in his muscles. "That's a lie," Nantan said, his voice controlled but dangerous. "We didn't touch anything that wasn't offered to us." "Then explain this." Sheriff Herrera held up a leather pouch that Clara immediately recognized. It was the kind of pouch merchants used to hold money. "We found it hidden near where you camped." Clara looked at the pouch, then at Sheriff Herrera, then at Nantan. And suddenly, everything made sense. It was a trap, a well-planned trap to break the peace agreement and give Sheriff Herrera an excuse to drive out the Apache. "That's a setup," Clara said, stepping forward before she could stop herself. Everyone turned to her. Sheriff Herrera looked at her with surprise and irritation. "What did you say?" "I said, that's a setup," Clara repeated louder. "You planted that pouch there." A murmur of shock went through the crowd. Sheriff Herrera turned red with rage. "How dare you accuse me? A freak like you. A freak who saw you do this before," Clara cried, feeling all the fear and pain of 5 years transform into fury. "A freak who saw you burn my house." The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the wind dared to blow. "What?" Sheriff Herrera whispered, turning pale. "I saw you," Clara continued, the words spilling out like tears held back for years. "That night, I saw you leave our house with a kerosene can. I saw you kill my parents because they discovered you were stealing from the church." The crowd erupted in murmurs. Sheriff Herrera looked around desperately. "She's lying. She's bewitched by the savages. No one can believe a word she says." "Then why are you so nervous?" a firm voice asked from behind Clara. It was Nantan. He approached and stood beside her, a solid, comforting presence. "Why would an innocent man be so afraid of the words of a freak?" he continued, looking directly at Sheriff Herrera. Because, Sheriff Herrera stammered, but couldn't form a sentence. "Because he knows it's true," Clara said, feeling certainty grow in her voice. "He knows I saw everything, and he knows he's doing the same thing now, lying, manipulating, destroying innocent lives to protect his own interests." Some men in the crowd began to look at Sheriff Herrera with suspicion. Clara saw an opening and continued. "Search his house," she said. "Look for the money my father discovered was missing from the church. Look for the documents that prove he's been selling land that doesn't belong to him." Sheriff Herrera turned livid, and Clara knew she had hit the mark. "Lies!" he cried. "All lies! Arrest this witch! Arrest all of them!" But it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted. Some men stepped forward, not to arrest Clara and the Apache, but to prevent Sheriff Herrera from fleeing. Everything happened very quickly after that. Sheriff Herrera's house was searched. The money was found. The documents too. The evidence was overwhelming, but for Clara, victory came at a high price. When the truth came out, when Sheriff Herrera was exposed as the criminal he was, the town turned against her in a different way. Not because they believed she was cursed, but because she had exposed the rot they preferred to ignore. "You destroyed our peace," Mrs. Esperanza Sanchez said, with cold hatred in her eyes. "You brought shame to all of us. You don't deserve to be here," Mrs. Isabel Gomez added. "Neither you nor your savage friends." The crowd murmured in agreement. Clara looked around and saw faces that had become masks of rejection. There was no place for her there. There never had been. "All right," she said, with a calm that surprised everyone, including herself. "I don't want to stay in a place where the truth is seen as betrayal." And without looking back, Clara returned home to pack her bags. An hour later, as she left Dust Devil Mesa, carrying only a small satchel and the Bible with the dried flowers, Nantan waited for her on the road with an extra horse. "Where to?" he asked simply. Clara looked back one last time. The town that had been her prison for 5 years was silent under the scorching sun. No one was saying goodbye. No one regretted her departure. "Anywhere but here," she replied. Nantan nodded and helped her mount. As they rode towards the mountains, Clara felt something strange in her chest. It wasn't sadness as she expected. It was relief. For the first time in her life, she was choosing her own path. And however uncertain it seemed infinitely better than the certainty of the suffering she left behind. 3 months had passed since Clara left Dust Devil Mesa, and for the first time in her life, she knew what it meant to belong somewhere. Nantan's Apache village was nestled among red rocks and resilient pines, protected from the desert wind but open to the endless sky. Clara had arrived there as a refugee, expecting tolerance at best. What she found was something she had never experienced: acceptance. It wasn't immediate. The first few days were filled with curious glances and whispers. But unlike Dust Devil Mesa, these whispers weren't cruel. They were cautious, questioning, but not malicious. In the first week, Clara had offered to help with any work. Her hands knew sewing, but she soon discovered they knew much more. She knew how to prepare herbal remedies her grandmother had taught her. She knew how to tend wounds with delicate precision. She knew how to listen to the silent pains people carried. The first child she healed was an 8-year-old boy who had fallen from a horse. The arm wound was infected, and the boy cried in pain day and night. Clara cleaned the wound, applied a mixture of herbs she had prepared, and cared for him for 3 straight days. When the fever broke and the boy smiled for the first time in weeks, something changed in how the village saw her. "She's the woman who defended Nantan," Clara heard one of the older women, Ayana, say on the 3rd day. "The one who spoke the truth when no one else would." "And look how she works," another voice replied. "Her hands know pain, but they also know healing." Clara was helping care for a sick child, using the sewing techniques she had learned to close a wound with delicate precision. Her hands no longer trembled. She had found a purpose that went beyond merely surviving. By the end of the first month, Clara had become an integral part of village life. In the morning, she helped the women prepare food. In the afternoon, she cared for the wounded and sick. At night, she taught the children to sew, while they taught her words in Apache. It was a life completely different from anything she had known. In Dust Devil Mesa, women competed with each other, measuring worth by appearance and status. In the Apache village, women supported each other, each contributing their unique skills for the good of all. "You seem stronger," Nantan said one night, as they walked through the village together. Clara looked at her own hands. They were more calloused, but also more confident. Her shoulders no longer curved inward, trying to hide. Her voice didn't hesitate when she spoke. "I feel stronger," she replied, "as if I'm finally using muscles I didn't know I had." Nantan smiled. During those 3 months, Clara had observed how he too changed. The constant weight of pain on his shoulders had lessened. He laughed more, spoke more. Sometimes Clara caught him watching her work with a look of quiet contentment. "My wife used to say that healing happens when we stop fighting who we are and start accepting," he said. "You're becoming who you always were beneath the pain." Clara stopped walking and turned to him. The moon was full, bathing everything in soft silver. Nantan looked younger in that light, less marked by the losses of the past. "And you?" she asked. "Who are you becoming?" Nantan was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Someone who can love again without feeling like I'm betraying memory," he finally said. "Someone who understood that the heart doesn't have limited space. It can hold the past and still have room for the future." Clara felt something stir in her chest. During the last few weeks, she had noticed small changes in how they interacted, conversations that lasted late into the night, casual touches that lingered longer than necessary, looks that said more than words. "Nantan," she said hesitantly, "may I ask about your wife?" He was quiet for a long moment. Clara had learned that Nantan processed emotions in silence before speaking about them. Her name was Itzel. he finally said. It means night star. She was everything I'm not. Laughing, spontaneous, full of light. When she died, I thought I'd never be able to see light anywhere again. Clara waited, knowing there was more. For 2 years, everything was darkness, Nantan continued. I fulfilled my duties, cared for my little brother, protected our village, but inside I was dead. Until that day in Dust Devil Mesa. What changed? You, he said simply. When I saw how they treated you, when I saw the strength you carried despite all the pain, something woke up in me. I recognized the pain, but I also recognized the courage. Clara felt her eyes well up. And now, Nantan looked at her with an intensity that made Clara feel warmth rise up her neck. Now I understand there's a different kind of light, he said. Not the light that shines alone, but the light that ignites when two people decide to face the darkness together. Clara felt her eyes water, not from sadness, but from a joy so pure it hurt. I love you, she said, the words coming out as a whispered confession. And I love you, he replied without hesitation. In a way I thought would never be possible again. They kissed there, under the moonlight, surrounded by the distant sound of village fires and the scent of desert flowers. It was a soft kiss, laden with promises and healing. Clara felt as if years of loneliness were dissolving in that moment. When they separated, Clara saw something in Nantan's eyes that sent another shiver down her spine. He was looking past her, towards the village entrance. His expression had completely changed. What is it? She asked, turning to follow his gaze. A rider approached at a gallop, raising a cloud of red dust. It was one of the young Apache warriors who had left 2 days earlier on patrol. Even from a distance, Clara could see something was wrong by the way he rode. Nantan stood up quickly and went to meet the rider. Clara followed him, a bad feeling growing in her stomach. Other villagers emerged from their homes, alerted by the sound of hooves. "Chief Nantan," the young man shouted before even dismounting. "Dust Devil Mesa, there's big trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Nantan asked, tense. The rider dismounted, panting, both he and his horse clearly exhausted from a forced journey. "Soldiers arrived in town 3 days ago," he said, trying to catch his breath. "Mexican soldiers, many soldiers. They arrested several men, including all those who testified against Sheriff Herrera." Clara felt her blood run cold. "He escaped from prison?" she asked. "Worse," the young warrior replied, looking directly at her. "He never went to prison. It seems he has powerful connections in the capital, influential relatives in the government. The soldiers came with direct orders to arrest everyone who slandered him, and there's more." "More what?" Nantan pressed, concern clear in his voice. "They're saying you two," the young man looked at Clara and Nantan, "are spies, that you planned everything to break the peace between the town and our people. Sheriff Herrera is using this as an excuse to take our lands by force." Clara felt the world spin around her. Everything they had fought for, all the truth she had been brave enough to reveal, was being distorted and used against innocent people. Ayana approached, her wise face marked by worry. "What else did you see, son?" she asked the young rider. "I saw families being driven from their homes," he replied sadly. "Anyone who spoke against Sheriff Herrera is being treated as a traitor, and they're promising rewards for information about you two." Clara backed away from the group, feeling nausea rise in her throat. Everything was happening because of her decision to speak the truth. Innocent people were suffering because she had chosen to fight. "How many soldiers?" Nantan asked, already thinking strategically. 50, maybe 60, and they have cannons, modern weapons. It's not something we can face directly." Nantan was quiet, calculating. Clara knew he was weighing his options: fight and put his village at risk, or flee and allow Sheriff Herrera to take the lands that were sacred to his people. "No," Clara said suddenly, in a voice that cut through the air like a blade. Everyone turned to her. "We're not running, and you're not fighting a war because of me," she continued, feeling determination grow in her voice. "We're going to do what should have been done from the start." What do you mean? Nantan asked. Clara looked around at the worried faces of the people who had become her family. She couldn't let them suffer because of her choices. We're going to show the truth to those who really matter, she said. Not to the soldiers or Sheriff Herrera, to the people of Dust Devil Mesa, to the people who are suffering because of his lies. Nantan studied her for a long moment. That's more than dangerous, he said. If we go back, we'll probably be executed on the spot. Sheriff Herrera won't risk letting us speak. Then so be it, Clara replied, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. I'd rather die fighting for the truth than live hidden while innocent people suffer because of me. It was then that something Clara had never experienced happened. The village women, who had watched the conversation from afar, approached as a group. Ayana, the matriarch, spoke first. The woman is right, she said, with authority that came from decades of wisdom. Sometimes the only way to stop a lie is to face it head-on, however dangerous it may be. But it's almost suicide, Nantan protested. I can't let her go back there. You can't let me or not let me do anything, Clara replied gently but firmly. I choose, and I choose to fight. Life is dangerous, another woman, Siala, mother of 3, said. But we are not cowards, and Clara is one of us now. We protect our own. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. One of us. The words she had never heard in Dust Devil Mesa, even though she was born there. We have a plan, Ayana said with a cunning smile that made Clara understand where Nantan had inherited his strategic intelligence. But it will require courage from all of us, and it will require you to trust women you've barely known for 3 months. I trust you more than I've trusted people I've known my whole life, Clara replied without hesitation. The plan was risky, but brilliant in its simplicity. Clara would return to Dust Devil Mesa, seemingly as Nantan's prisoner. This would satisfy Sheriff Herrera and the soldiers who expected her to be captured and brought to be made an example of. But once there, during the public execution that would surely be organized, Clara would tell the full truth, not just about Sheriff Herrera, but about everything she had learned during her stay with the Apache. What if they don't believe her? Nantan asked. What if Sheriff Herrera just orders her killed before she can speak? They'll believe, Clara said, with a confidence that surprised even herself. Because I won't be alone. She looked at the Apache women around her. All had volunteered to go with her, disguised as merchants, travelers, or distant relatives visiting the town. We'll be a silent army, Ayana explained. We'll spread the truth even before you arrive. We'll plant seeds of doubt. When you speak, the ground will already be prepared. And I'll be there, Nantan said with absolute determination, whatever the outcome. Clara looked at him, seeing the resolve in his dark eyes. If we do this, we might not survive, she said, wanting to make sure he fully understood the risks. Then we'll die together, he replied simply. I'd rather that than live knowing I didn't fight by your side when you needed me. They spent the next 2 days preparing. The Apache women rehearsed their disguises and their stories. Clara memorized every detail of evidence she could use against Sheriff Herrera. Nantan checked his weapons and planned escape routes in case everything went wrong. On the night before their departure, Clara and Nantan walked together to the edge of the village, where a panoramic view showed the desert stretching infinitely under the stars. Are you afraid? Nantan asked. Clara considered the question honestly. Yes, she said, but not the kind of fear that paralyzed me before. This is a fear that keeps me alert, a fear that reminds me that what we're doing matters. If something goes wrong, Nantan began. It won't, Clara interrupted. Not because we have guarantees, but because we're going to make it work, together. He smiled, and Clara saw in that smile the man he had been before the loss, the man he was becoming again. How did you get so wise? He asked. I learned from people who value wisdom more than appearance, she replied, looking back at the village, where the campfires glowed like fallen stars. I learned that true strength doesn't come from not having scars, but from choosing what to do with them. 2 days later, Clara rode back to Dust Devil Mesa with her hands tied, playing the role of prisoner. Nantan escorted her, playing the role of an Apache bounty hunter. Around them, disguised among merchants and travelers on the road, 12 Apache women headed for the town by different routes. Clara's heart pounded as Dust Devil Mesa appeared on the horizon. The town seemed smaller than in her memories, more insignificant against the vastness of the desert, but also more threatening, now surrounded by military tents and uniformed soldiers. When they arrived, the reception was exactly as expected. Sheriff Herrera, now free and more arrogant than ever, organized a celebration. Mexican soldiers positioned themselves around the square. The population was forced to watch under the barrels of rifles. Clara observed the faces in the crowd as she was dragged to the center of the square. She recognized Mrs. Esperanza Sanchez, Mrs. Isabel Gomez, and other women who had made her life hell. But she also saw fear in those faces, real fear. The town was under military occupation, and everyone knew that any wrong word could mean prison or death. "Look!" Sheriff Herrera shouted, pointing at Clara with exaggerated dramatic flair. "The traitor has been captured. The woman who lied about me, who brought dishonor to our town, who sold herself to the savages, will finally pay for her crimes." The crowd murmured, but Clara noticed that many faces didn't show joy. They showed fear, sadness, and something that could be guilt. Some even looked away when she stared at them. "Before she dies," Sheriff Herrera continued, savoring every word, "she will confess her lies before everyone. She will admit that she conspired with the savages to destroy our peace." Clara was pushed to the center of the square. A Mexican soldier approached with a drawn sword, clearly prepared to execute her as soon as she confessed. Her legs trembled, but not from fear, from adrenaline. The moment she had prepared for had arrived. "Yes," she said, her voice loud and clear enough for the entire square to hear, "I will confess." Sheriff Herrera smiled triumphant. The soldiers relaxed slightly, expecting a quick confession followed by execution. "I will confess that I lied about one thing," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I lied when I said Sheriff Herrera killed my parents only for money." A murmur of confusion went through the crowd. Sheriff Herrera frowned, clearly not expecting this turn. "The truth is much worse," Clara cried, projecting her voice to echo through the adobe walls. "He killed them because they discovered he was selling girls from the town to rich men in the capital." The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. Even the soldiers stopped moving. Then, as if a dam had broken, the Apache women disguised in the crowd began to speak, exactly as planned. "It's true!" Ayana shouted, disguised as a fabric merchant. "I saw the documents. I saw the names of the girls and the prices paid for them. My niece disappeared after talking to him," Ciala cried, pretending to be a traveler. "She was investigating the disappearance of friends." "And Maria Rodriguez's daughter? Where is she?" a third Apache woman cried. "She was only 15 when she vanished." Sheriff Herrera turned livid and began screaming orders at the soldiers, but the voices kept multiplying. And then, to Clara's surprise, some women from Dust Devil Mesa began to speak too. Voices that had been silenced by fear began to rise. "My daughter Teresa!" a woman in the crowd cried, tears streaming down her face. "She said Sheriff Herrera had called her for a private conversation the day before she disappeared." "And little Anna, who disappeared last month," another cried. "She had commented about strange men asking about single girls. I saw well-dressed men visiting his house at night," a third cried. "Men with a lot of money, who looked at our daughters as if they were cattle." The truth exploded like a long-suppressed volcano. Sheriff Herrera tried to shout, to drown out the voices, ordering the soldiers to arrest the insurgents, but it was too late. The entire crowd was talking now, sharing suspicions they had held back out of fear, connecting dots they hadn't dared to connect before. And then something happened that no one expected. Maria, the little girl who always visited Clara, broke through the crowd, running. Her mother tried to hold her back, but the child was too determined. "Aunt Clara!" she cried, clinging to Clara's skirts. "He tried to take me too! Mama hid me in the barn, but he tried!" The crowd erupted in absolute fury. Until that moment, one could argue that the accusations were just rumors. But a 7-year-old child didn't lie about something like that. And everyone in town knew Maria, knew she was an honest, innocent child. Sheriff Herrera, realizing he was completely lost, tried to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The crowd surrounded him, and the soldiers themselves, confronted with evidence of crimes against children, hesitated to protect him. The captain of the soldiers approached Sheriff Herrera with a grim expression. "Mr. Herrera," he said formally, "these are very serious accusations. I will have to investigate them thoroughly." "They're all lies!" Sheriff Herrera cried, desperate. "A conspiracy of savages. You can't believe—" "Then explain this," the captain interrupted, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "A letter we intercepted yesterday, addressed to your contacts in the capital. It details prices and characteristics of several young women." Clara couldn't see the content of the letter from that distance, but she saw Sheriff Herrera's face turn completely pale. Apparently, the Apache women had done more than disguise themselves. They had investigated. The crowd roared with rage. Sheriff Herrera was finished, and everyone knew it. Clara stood in the center of the chaos, watching as the truth finally came out. Men who had been arrested for slandering Sheriff Herrera were immediately released. Families who had been driven from their homes could return. And the town of Dust Devil Mesa faced for the first time the reality of its own prejudices and complicit silence. Nantan approached and cut her false bonds. "You did it," he said with admiration and pride in his voice. "We did it," Clara corrected, looking at the Apache women who had risked their lives to help her, and at the women of Dust Devil Mesa who had finally found the courage to speak. When the dust settled, Sheriff Herrera was truly imprisoned, this time in shackles that could not be broken by political influence. The families of the missing girls finally had hope of discovering the truth about what had happened to their daughters. And the town of Dust Devil Mesa faced the reality of its own complicity and silence. The captain of the soldiers approached Clara and Nantan with a respectful expression. "Madam, sir," he said, with military formality, "you are free to go. On behalf of the Mexican government, I apologize. We were deceived by a skilled criminal." Clara nodded but did not move. There was still something she needed to do, something she had mentally rehearsed throughout the journey. She turned to the crowd, to the faces that had rejected her, humiliated her, tried to destroy her. Faces that now looked at her with a mixture of shame, guilt, and something that could be respect. "You called me cursed," she said, her voice firm but without anger. "You treated me as if I were contagious, as if my pain was a disease that could spread to you." The crowd fell completely silent. Even the children stopped moving. "You humiliated me because I was different," Clara continued. "Because I carried visible scars while you hid yours. Because it was easier to blame me for the town's problems than to face the real villains among you." She paused, looking into the eyes of every person she could see. "But you were right about one thing," she said, her voice gaining a strength that came from deep within. "I really was different. I was different because I refused to accept that suffering was normal. I was different because I believed everyone deserved dignity, even when no one gave me mine. I was different because even when you broke me repeatedly, I didn't break others in return." Mrs. Esperanza Sanchez began to cry. Several other women bowed their heads, unable to meet her gaze. "The beauty you thought you took from me wasn't true beauty," Clara continued. "It was just a mask, an empty shell that only mattered to empty people. I found true beauty when I learned to see beyond the scars, mine and others. When I learned that strength doesn't come from hurting the weak, but from protecting the defenseless." Clara turned to Nantan, who watched her with love and pride shining in his eyes. I choose not to live here anymore, she said, turning back to the crowd, not out of anger or revenge, but because I found a home where what matters isn't what you look like on the outside, but who you are inside. Where strength doesn't come from diminishing others, but from lifting each other up. She took Nantan's hand, lacing their fingers together. But if someday any of you need help, healing, someone who understands what it's like to be rejected and still choose love, you know where to find me. Little Maria broke free from her mother's hand and ran to hug Clara one last time. I'll miss you, Aunt Clara, the girl whispered. And I'll miss you, sweetie, Clara replied, caressing the child's hair. But whenever you want to visit me, you'll be welcome. And with that, Clara walked out of Dust Devil Mesa for the second and last time. But now she wasn't fleeing. She was choosing love over fear, choosing courage over conformity, choosing a future over a past, choosing dignity over acceptance. As they rode towards the mountains, accompanied by the Apache women who had become her sisters, Nantan looked at her. Are you sure? He asked. About leaving all this behind. Clara looked back one last time. Dust Devil Mesa diminished on the horizon, but didn't disappear completely. It would always be part of her story. The difference was that now she chose which part of her history would define her future. I'm sure, she said, about leaving the past, about embracing the future, about everything. Even about me? Nantan asked, with a shy smile that reminded her of how kind he had been from the very first moment. Clara stopped her horse and turned to him completely. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky orange, pink, and purple. It was too beautiful to be real, but it was real. Like the love she felt, like the life she had chosen, like the woman she had become, like the future she was building. Especially about you, she said. And as they kissed there, in the middle of the desert that was no longer hostile but was home, surrounded by women who had become family, Clara finally understood what Nantan had said about two kinds of light. She no longer needed to shine alone in the darkness. She had found not only someone to carry the light with her, but an entire community that believed that shared light was stronger than any darkness. And together they could illuminate any path they chose to follow. 6 months later, Clara was by the Lost River, teaching a group of Apache children to sew when she saw a small entourage approaching the village. She immediately recognized the group's leader, Mrs. Rosa Rodriguez, Maria's mother. The woman was accompanied by 3 other mothers from Dust Devil Mesa, all carrying gifts and nervous expressions. Clara, Mrs. Rosa Rodriguez said when she got close, her voice trembling with emotion. I came to ask for forgiveness. And to bring Maria to visit you, as I promised. Clara looked at little Maria, who ran into her arms with the same love as always. Then she looked at the other women who had participated in her humiliation, who had spread cruel rumors, who had tried to destroy her. You don't need forgiveness, Clara said gently. We need understanding and peace. We want to learn, Mrs. Rosa Rodriguez said, about how to be better, about how to raise our daughters to be strong like you became, about how to see beyond appearances. Clara smiled, feeling a deep peace settle in her heart. Then come, she said. There's always room here for those who want to learn. And so, under the endless New Mexico sky, 2 communities that had lived separated by fear and prejudice slowly began to build bridges. Clara had found not only love, but purpose. Not just a home, but a mission. She had become the bridge between 2 worlds. And her scars finally told the story she wanted to tell, of a woman who chose to transform pain into healing, rejection into acceptance, and hatred into love.